His credit card declined. Humiliation burned through him. Henry Lawson, accustomed to boardroom power, stood paralyzed as a stranger's kindness shattered his armor. Single mom thought she was helping a struggling dad wasn't supposed to be his story. Yet Abigail's genuine heart awakened something forgotten in his own. Her fingerprints would soon mark more than just his receipt. The fluorescent lights of Foster's Market seemed particularly harsh that evening, casting an unforgiving glow across Henry Lawson's exhausted face. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline as he frantically tapped his platinum card against the payment terminal for the third time, each unsuccessful attempt punctuated by the same robotic voice declaring, "Payment declined." The checkout line behind him had grown from 2 people to 7, their collective impatience a palpable force, pressing against his back. Henry could feel his carefully constructed world of corporate invincibility crumbling around him, replaced by the mundane humiliation that ordinary people experienced, something he had been insulated from for the better part of 2 decades as the founder and CEO of Lawson Innovations, a company whose technological advancements had transformed 3 industries and made him a fortune that should have rendered this moment impossible. "I don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to the cashier whose name tag read Tina, and whose expression had shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed annoyance. "I just used this card this morning." His fingers now trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, scrolling frantically through his banking app which, to his mounting horror, refused to load. Network error. The milk and eggs in his cart suddenly seemed absurdly insignificant compared to the boardroom decisions he'd made just hours earlier, approving budgets in the millions without a second thought. Now here he stood, unable to complete a simple transaction for groceries that would barely fill 2 bags. His tailored suit and Italian leather shoes suddenly feeling like an elaborate costume, rather than the armor of success he'd always considered them to be. The hushed whispers from the line behind him were starting to register, snippets of conversation that stabbed at his pride. "Isn't that the tech guy from the news? Guess things aren't going so well at that company of his." And worst of all, a softly spoken, "How the mighty have fallen." Henry felt a flush of heat spread across his face and down his neck, the physical manifestation of shame he hadn't experienced since childhood. He considered abandoning the groceries altogether, walking out with whatever dignity he could salvage, but his feet remained rooted to the spot, as if the universe had decided this lesson in humility required his full, undivided attention. The world he navigated with such confidence, of executive decisions and market predictions, seemed galaxies away from this fluorescent-lit reality, where his worth was reduced to the functionality of a piece of plastic. What happened next would replay in Henry's mind for months to come, a moment so unexpected it cut through his humiliation like a shaft of light through darkness. A voice, calm and without pretense, spoke from somewhere to his right. "I can get this," it said, and Henry turned to see a woman stepping forward, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the green apron of a Foster's Market manager. Before he could process what was happening, she had swiped her own card through the terminal, the cheerful beep of acceptance cutting through the tense atmosphere like a bell signaling the end of his public trial. The woman, Abigail, according to her name tag, didn't make eye contact with him as she signed the receipt, didn't acknowledge the stares of the other customers, simply completed the transaction as if it were the most natural thing in the world to rescue a stranger from social crucifixion. Only when the groceries were bagged and the next customer was moving forward did she finally meet his gaze, her eyes neither pitying nor judgmental, but clear with a simple human recognition that made Henry's rehearsed expressions of corporate gratitude die in his throat. "You don't have to," he began, but she shook her head once, a subtle movement that silenced him more effectively than any boardroom interruption ever had. "Just promise to help the next person," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear, the simplicity of her request striking him as profoundly as any business proposal he'd ever received. And then she was gone, moving down the aisle to assist another customer, leaving Henry standing there with his 2 bags of groceries and the unsettling awareness that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of value and worth. The cool evening air hit Henry's face as he exited the market, a welcome relief from the stifling embarrassment he'd left behind. He placed the bags in the passenger seat of his luxury sedan, the leather interior suddenly seeming garish rather than sophisticated. As he sat behind the wheel, he didn't immediately start the engine, but instead stared at the illuminated storefront of Foster's Market, watching as the woman who had rescued him, Abigail, moved efficiently between registers, checking inventory, assisting an elderly customer with reaching a high shelf. The contrast between his world of glass-walled offices and hers of practical, immediate service struck him with unexpected force. "Just promise to help the next person," she had said. The words echoing in his mind not as a platitude but as a challenge, one that made the quarterly reports and shareholder meetings that dominated his existence suddenly seem hollow, devoid of the human connection that had been offered to him without expectation by a stranger whose name he only knew from a plastic badge. The morning after his humiliation at Foster's Market dawned with a clarity that seemed almost offensive to Henry, as if the universe were too quickly moving on from a moment that had shaken him to his core. He stood before the wall of windows in his penthouse apartment, coffee cooling in an untouched mug as he gazed out at the city skyline, a panorama of glass and steel he had always viewed as a testament to human ambition, but which now seemed like an elaborate maze designed to separate people rather than connect them. The night had brought little sleep, his mind replaying not the technical glitch that had caused his card to be declined, but rather the simple, unadorned kindness of the woman who had stepped forward when he was at his most vulnerable. In the harsh light of morning, Henry realized with uncomfortable clarity that had their positions been reversed, he likely wouldn't have noticed her distress at all, so accustomed was he to moving through the world with the tunnel vision of success. His phone had been buzzing relentlessly since dawn, emails from his executive team, updates on the community development project that was weeks behind schedule and millions over budget, messages from board members concerned about the direction of the company's latest initiative. Normally, these digital demands energized him, reaffirming his position at the center of a world he had helped build. Today, however, they felt like chains tethering him to an identity that, for the first time in years, he was beginning to question. The face that stared back at him from the bathroom mirror as he'd prepared for the day hadn't belonged to Henry Lawson, CEO of Lawson Innovations, but to Henry Lawson, the man who couldn't pay for his groceries and had been saved not by his wealth or status, but by the simple humanity of a stranger who asked nothing in return except that he extend the same kindness to someone else. The drive to Foster's Market was impulsive, a deviation from his meticulously scheduled day that would send his assistant into a panic when he failed to appear for his 9:00 a.m. strategy meeting. He told himself he was going merely to repay the debt, to write a check that would close this unexpected chapter and allow him to return to the familiar narrative of his life. But as he parked in the same spot he'd occupied the night before, Henry knew with uncomfortable honesty that his motives were more complex, that something about Abigail's unaffected kindness had pierced a protective layer he hadn't even recognized he'd built around himself. The automatic doors of the market slid open to admit him, the morning bustle of shoppers and employees creating a symphony of ordinary life that he usually experienced only as background noise to his more important existence. Finding her wasn't difficult. She was at the customer service desk, her dark hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail, though today she wore a blue blouse under her green manager's apron rather than yesterday's white one. Henry approached with an envelope in hand, containing $500, a sum that seemed both excessive and inadequate for what she had done. As he waited for her to finish assisting an elderly woman with a return, he rehearsed what he would say, corporate phrases of appreciation that sounded hollow even in his mind. When Abigail finally turned to him, recognition flickered across her features, not surprise but a calm acknowledgement, as if she had half expected him to return. "Mr. she began, clearly searching for a name he hadn't offered the night before, and in that moment of hesitation, Henry made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives in ways he couldn't possibly foresee. "Henry," he said simply, withholding his last name and with it, his identity as the CEO whose face occasionally appeared in business journals and local news segments. "I wanted to thank you properly for last night." He extended the envelope, which she made no move to take. Her eyes, he now noticed they were a warm, intelligent brown, assessing him with a directness few people in his life ever dared. "That's not necessary," she replied, her voice carrying the same quiet assurance it had the night before. "Like I said, just help someone else when you get the chance." There was something in her refusal that didn't wound his pride, but instead awakened his curiosity, a quality he had built his business empire on, but had somehow forgotten to apply to the people who populated his world. Before he could respond, a small voice called out, "Mom!" and a young girl of about 9 appeared at Abigail's side, dark hair in braids and eyes that mirrored her mother's in both color and perceptiveness. The introduction to Zoe, Abigail's daughter, shifted the dynamic of their interaction entirely, moving it from a transaction Henry had intended to complete to a human connection he hadn't anticipated. "Mom helps people all the time," Zoe informed him with the unfiltered honesty of childhood, "even when we have to eat mac and cheese 3 nights in a row after." The statement, delivered without self-pity but as a simple fact, hit Henry with unexpected force. The realization that Abigail's gesture the night before hadn't come from abundance, but from principles that existed independent of financial comfort. As Abigail gently suggested Zoe return to the break room to finish her homework before their bus arrived, Henry found himself struck by the complexity hidden behind what he had assumed was a simple interaction between strangers. Here was a single mother working as a market manager, raising a child with evident care and values, extending kindness from what appeared to be limited resources, while he, with all his wealth, had become so disconnected from such basic human exchanges that her action had left him disoriented. The conversation that followed as Abigail took her break, 15 minutes during which she revealed more about herself than many of Henry's executives shared in years of working together, transformed his impulsive visit into something far more significant. She had been an architect, she told him, with evident passion in her voice as she described her former work designing spaces meant to enhance community interaction and accessibility. Her decision to leave the field had come when Zoe was born with health issues that required more attention than a demanding career would allow. The market job offered the flexibility she needed, though she still freelanced occasionally, small projects that kept her skills sharp while allowing her to be the mother Zoe needed. As Henry listened, offering little about himself beyond vague references to working in tech, he became aware of a growing certainty that their paths crossing wasn't merely chance but opportunity, not just for him to repay a debt of kindness, but perhaps to reconnect with something essential he had lost in his ascent to success, something Abigail seemed to possess in abundance despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges life had handed her. The Riverview Community Center project had been Henry's idea, a philanthropic endeavor meant to revitalize a struggling neighborhood with a multi-use facility that would provide educational resources, healthcare services, and recreational spaces for residents across economic spectrums. But what had begun as a vision of corporate responsibility and community partnership had devolved into a bureaucratic nightmare of budget overruns, design flaws, and diminishing board support. 3 architects had already come and gone, each failing to translate the ambitious social goals of the project into a design that was both practical and financially viable. Now, as Henry stood before the scale model in the Lawson Innovations conference room, studying the latest iteration with growing frustration, Abigail's casual mention of her architectural background during their conversation at Foster's Market the day before seemed to crystallize into something that felt remarkably like fate. The decision to approach her about consulting on the project formed in his mind, with the same instinctive certainty that had guided his most successful business ventures, but this time complicated by the deception he had already begun by withholding his full identity. Henry spent the afternoon researching her previous work, his assistant puzzled by his sudden interest in an architect who had stepped away from the profession years ago, but whose portfolio, though limited, showed a distinctive vision that prioritized human experience over aesthetic showmanship. The designs Abigail had created before leaving the field revealed spaces that felt at once innovative and intuitive, technical excellence in service of human connection, rather than architectural ego. What struck Henry most forcefully as he scrolled through digital archives of her work was how perfectly her approach aligned with what the Riverview project needed, and how unlikely it was that she would agree to work with Henry Lawson, CEO, given the wariness he had sensed beneath her kindness. The phone call to Abigail came that evening, after Henry had rehearsed and discarded a dozen approaches. He introduced himself simply as Henry from the market, working with a community development team that needed architectural consultation. The omission of his last name and position wasn't technically a lie, he told himself, merely a strategic withholding of information that might create unnecessary barriers. Abigail's initial hesitation was palpable, even through the phone line, her responsibilities to Zoe clearly her primary concern. But when Henry mentioned the project's focus on creating spaces for after-school programs and health services for families who couldn't otherwise afford them, he heard a shift in her voice, the awakening of the passion he had glimpsed when she spoke of her former work. The salary he proposed for a 3-month consultation was generous without being suspicious, and the flexible hours accommodating of her current job and Zoe's needs. By the call's end, they had arranged to meet at the project site the following afternoon, and Henry found himself both exhilarated by the prospect of breathing new life into the faltering project and uneasily aware of the deception that underlay this potential collaboration. The construction site that had once been an abandoned warehouse stood in skeletal incompletion when Henry met Abigail there. Spring sunlight illuminating the structural beams and half-finished walls that represented both the project's promise and its problems. He watched her face as she walked the space, her expression shifting from professional assessment to growing engagement, fingers occasionally reaching out to touch a surface or trace an imaginary line in the air. "The concept is sound," she said finally, turning to him with eyes alight with the kind of authentic enthusiasm Henry rarely encountered in his corporate world. "But the execution is fighting against the purpose instead of serving it." She pulled out a small sketchbook from her bag, began to draw with quick, confident strokes, talking all the while about flow patterns and light sources, about how spaces could either facilitate human connection or subtly discourage it. As architectural jargon gave way to deeply humane observations about how people actually lived and moved and interacted, Henry found himself captivated not just by her obvious expertise, but by the vision she was articulating, one that somehow captured exactly what he had originally hoped the Riverview Center could be before committees and compromises had diluted it. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed that felt both professional and strangely intimate, as Henry arranged for Abigail to meet with various members of the project team, carefully selected to exclude anyone who might recognize him as the CEO rather than a mid-level project manager. Her initial sketches evolved into comprehensive redesigns that preserved the project's ambitious social goals while finding practical solutions to the budget and timeline issues that had plagued it from the start. The board meeting where Henry would present these new plans loomed on the horizon, a deadline that gave their work urgency, but also marked the inevitable moment when his deception would have to end. Each time Abigail's innovation solved a problem that had stymied the previous architects, each time her insight reframed a challenge as an opportunity, Henry felt both vindicated in his instinct to bring her onto the project and increasingly trapped by the web of half-truths he had spun to make it possible. What he hadn't anticipated was how much he would come to value their interactions beyond their professional utility, the way Abigail challenged his thinking without ever seeming confrontational, her genuine excitement when a design element solved multiple problems at once, the stories she shared about Zoe's perspective on spaces that adults often overlooked. On a particularly productive afternoon, as they sat amid blueprints spread across a makeshift table at the construction site, Abigail paused in the middle of explaining a modification to ask, "Why did you really approach me for this, Henry?" The directness of the question caught him off guard, the guilty flush rising in his cheeks before he could compose a response. "Your work is exceptional," he said finally, which was true but incomplete. She studied him with those perceptive brown eyes, seeming to look past his careful composure to something he himself was only beginning to recognize. That somewhere between her act of kindness in the market and their collaboration on the Riverview project, Henry had developed feelings for Abigail that had nothing to do with architecture or professional admiration, feelings that made the deception he maintained feel increasingly like a betrayal rather than a necessary strategy. The boardroom of Lawson Innovations occupied the entire top floor of the company's downtown headquarters, its glass walls offering panoramic views of the city, whose skyline Henry had helped reshape over the past 15 years. Today, however, the spectacular vista seemed like an ironic backdrop for the internal landscape he navigated, a terrain of conflicting loyalties and identities that had become increasingly difficult to reconcile. At one end of the massive oak table sat the board members, men and women whose support had been instrumental in building his empire, but whose patience with the Riverview project was visibly wearing thin. At the other end stood Henry himself, poised to present Abigail's revolutionary redesigns, without acknowledging their true architect, a deception that sat like lead in his stomach, even as he recognized it as possibly necessary to save the project that had come to mean more to him than he had ever anticipated. "The modifications address every concern raised in our last quarter review," Henry began, his voice carrying the confident authority expected of him in this room, even as part of him felt like an imposter, not because he didn't belong here, but because the credit he was implicitly claiming belonged elsewhere. The presentation unfolded with practiced precision, digital renderings of Abigail's designs appearing on the massive screens that lined the boardroom walls, each image accompanied by metrics demonstrating how her innovative approach would bring the project back within budget, while enhancing rather than compromising its community impact. What Henry hadn't prepared for was how deeply personal this presentation would feel, how each slide showcasing Abigail's work seemed to him not just a professional solution, but a window into her values and vision. Elements of her character he had come to admire during their weeks of collaboration, admiration that had evolved into feelings he had neither sought nor expected when he first approached her about the project. "These are remarkable improvements," said Eleanor Winters, the board member whose skepticism about the Riverview project had been most vocal, and whose approval would sway the others. "But they represent a fundamental departure from the direction we've been pursuing. Where did this new vision come from?" The directness of the question hung in the air, an opportunity for honesty that Henry both longed for and feared. In that suspended moment, he saw with perfect clarity the two paths before him: continue the deception, claiming these innovations as developments from the existing team, or acknowledge Abigail's contribution, and with it, the circumstances of their meeting and his subsequent duplicity. The silence stretched uncomfortably as board members exchanged glances, unused to seeing their decisive CEO hesitate over what should have been a straightforward question about project management. "We brought in a consulting architect," Henry said finally, choosing a middle path that was neither complete honesty nor outright deception. "Someone with a fresh perspective who could see possibilities where we had become fixated on problems." As he elaborated on Abigail's qualifications while carefully avoiding any mention of Foster's Market or declined credit cards, Henry became aware of a subtle shift in his own narrative, from presenting her work as a solution to the Riverview project's challenges to advocating for her vision with a personal investment that went beyond professional respect. The board responded positively to the designs themselves, but Henry could see in their expressions a growing curiosity about this unnamed architect who had apparently succeeded where established firms had failed, and about their CEO's unusual enthusiasm for a project that, until recently, had seemed destined for the corporate chopping block despite its philanthropic intentions. The meeting concluded with provisional approval to proceed with the redesigned plans, a victory that should have filled Henry with uncomplicated satisfaction. Instead, as the board members filed out of the room with murmured congratulations, He remained at the table, staring at the final image still projected on the screen. Abigail's rendering of the community center's entrance plaza, a space designed to welcome people of all ages and backgrounds, with subtle architectural cues that conveyed belonging rather than intimidation. It struck him suddenly how this design reflected exactly the quality in Abigail that had first caught his attention. Her ability to see beyond surface appearances to underlying human needs, to create connections rather than barriers. The realization that he had exploited this very quality, while deliberately misleading her about his identity, filled him with a shame more profound than anything he had experienced during his moment of public humiliation at the market. The decision to reveal the truth to Abigail formed with a certainty that overshadowed all strategic considerations, though the practical voice that had guided his business success warned that such honesty might cost him both the architect whose vision had saved his project and the woman whose company he had come to value more than he had believed possible. That afternoon, as spring sunshine warmed the construction site where they had arranged to meet to discuss the board's decision, Henry watched Abigail approach with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Admiration for the quiet confidence in her stride, the practical elegance of her appearance so different from the calculated impressions crafted by the people in his usual circles. Apprehension at the knowledge that the truth he was about to share might transform her warm regard into justified anger. "The board approved your designs," he said when she reached him, a smile breaking across her face with unguarded delight at this professional validation that made what he had to say next all the more difficult. "But there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you from the beginning." And as construction equipment rumbled in the background and dust motes danced in the slanting afternoon light, Henry Lawson finally introduced himself properly to Abigail Reed, watching as recognition, confusion, and finally a deep, wounded disappointment replaced the joy in her expressive eyes. Abigail stood motionless as Henry's words hung in the space between them, the revelation of his true identity transforming the construction site around them into a stage set for a betrayal she hadn't seen coming. "You're Henry Lawson," she repeated, her voice unnaturally calm. "CEO of Lawson Innovations." It wasn't a question but a recalibration, as if she were mentally revisiting every conversation they'd had over the past weeks, reinterpreting each exchange through this new lens of understanding. Henry watched emotions play across her face with a transparency he had come to cherish, the openness that stood in such stark contrast to the calculated expressions he encountered in boardrooms. But now that very quality made her hurt unbearably visible to him, the architect of her pain. "The man whose groceries I paid for at Foster's Market," she continued, a brittle edge entering her voice, "who then created an elaborate fiction too. What, exactly? Test if I was worth hiring? See how the other half lives? Get a good anecdote for your next charity gala?" "It wasn't like that," Henry protested, reaching toward her but stopping when she took an instinctive step back, the physical distance between them suddenly symbolic of the breach his deception had created. "I wanted to thank you for your kindness that night, and when I learned you were an architect—" He broke off, recognizing how hollow his explanations sounded now, how what had seemed like justifiable means to an end revealed itself as fundamentally dishonest when faced with Abigail's direct gaze. "The project is real," he continued, gesturing to the half-finished structure around them. "Your work on it has been transformative. The board approved everything you designed." He meant this as reassurance, as evidence that whatever his personal failings, her professional contribution was valued and would make a difference to the community this center would serve. But the slight lift of her chin told him his words had missed their mark entirely, had perhaps even deepened the injury. "I don't care about the board's approval," Abigail said, her voice low but intense. "I care about honesty. I've spent the last 3 years teaching my daughter that integrity matters more than success, that who you are means more than what you have or what position you hold." Her words struck Henry with the force of recognition. This was precisely the quality in her that had drawn him in, the uncompromising authenticity that made her kindness to him that night in the market not a calculated social gesture but a genuine human response. The irony that he had been attracted to this very quality while systematically deceiving her, was not lost on him. A contradiction that now seemed to define the gulf between the man he presented to the world and the one he actually was. I believed we were collaborating as equals, she continued, sharing a vision for what this center could mean to people who need it. Instead, I was auditioning for the great Henry Lawson without even knowing it. The portable office trailer where they had spent so many hours poring over blueprints and models stood just yards away, containing all the evidence of their productive partnership. Sketches pinned to corkboards, material samples arranged on tables, the coffee mugs that had sustained them through late afternoon sessions when ideas flowed faster than they could document them. Henry gestured toward it, a silent invitation to continue this conversation somewhere less exposed than the middle of an active construction site. But Abigail shook her head once, definitively. "I'm not going back in there," she said, and he understood she meant not just the trailer, but the entire project, the collaboration that had come to mean far more to him than professional success. She reached into her bag and withdrew a flash drive, holding it out to him with fingers that trembled slightly, despite the steadiness of her gaze. "All my designs, notes, and specifications are on here. The project doesn't need me anymore, just my ideas, which you now own." Taking the flash drive, Henry felt the weight of it in his palm like a verdict, this small object containing all that would remain of their work together, of the connection he had begun to believe might extend beyond the completion of the Riverview Center. "Abigail," he began, her name feeling different on his tongue now that pretense had been stripped away. "I never meant to." But she cut him off with a raised hand, her expression shifting from hurt to a composed resignation that somehow wounded him more deeply than anger would have. "It doesn't matter what you meant," she said, and for the first time since they'd met, he heard in her voice the weariness of someone who had learned through hard experience to expect disappointment, a quality she had never shown him before, but which he now realized must have been there all along, carefully contained beneath her practical optimism. "What matters is what you did. You had every opportunity to tell me the truth, and you chose not to, again and again." The finality in her voice as she turned to leave struck Henry with panic, a visceral certainty that if he let her walk away now, something irreplaceable would be lost. Not just her architectural expertise or even the possibility of personal connection that had begun to grow between them, but a chance to become the kind of man who deserved the faith she had initially placed in him. "The board meeting is next Thursday," he called after her, the words sounding desperate even to his own ears. "Final approval of the full project. You should be there. It's your vision they're voting on." Abigail paused but didn't turn around, her shoulders tense beneath the light jacket she wore against the spring breeze. "Present it yourself, Mr. Lawson," she said, the formal address an unmistakable reinforcement of the boundary she was drawing. "You're clearly skilled at representing other people's work." And then she was walking away, her figure growing smaller against the backdrop of construction equipment and city skyline, leaving Henry alone with the flash drive in his hand and the hollow understanding that in trying to secure her talent for a project that mattered to him, he had sacrificed something that might have mattered far more. In the week that followed, Henry threw himself into preparations for the final board presentation with an intensity that alarmed even his most dedicated executives. The Riverview Community Center had always been a personal project for him, but now it seemed to have consumed him entirely. Every detail scrutinized, every potential question from the board anticipated and answered before it could be asked. His assistant, Ms. Chen, who had worked with him for 7 years and prided herself on her ability to read his moods, found herself unable to categorize this new version of her boss, focused yet distracted, demanding yet strangely vulnerable, as if something essential had shifted in his understanding of what constituted success. When she finally worked up the courage to ask if everything was all right, Henry looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, a rawness that seemed out of place on the face of a man who controlled markets with a word. "I made a mistake," he said simply, "and I'm not sure it's one I can fix." The night before the board meeting, Henry stood alone in the Riverview Center, construction crews long gone, The security guard instructed to give him privacy as he walked the spaces that Abigail had reimagined. Her designs were everywhere, in the way natural light would filter through specially placed windows to illuminate gathering areas, in the intuitive flow between public and private spaces, in the thousand small details that demonstrated her understanding of how physical environments shaped human experience. Without her presence beside him, pointing out features with that infectious enthusiasm, the building felt like a beautiful but hollow shell, her vision made manifest in steel and glass but bereft of the spirit that had conceived it. As he traced his fingers along a wall that would eventually house a mural created by local artists, her idea, Henry confronted the truth he had been avoiding since Abigail had walked away from the project, that in his pursuit of corporate success and public recognition, he had lost sight of the very human connections that gave such achievements meaning, and that the woman who had reminded him of this fundamental truth wanted nothing more to do with him. The boardroom hummed with anticipatory tension as executives and board members settled into their leather chairs, the morning sunlight streaming through the wall of windows adding a theatrical quality to the proceedings that Henry typically orchestrated with practiced precision. Today, however, as he stood at the head of the table waiting for the last stragglers to take their seats, he felt none of his usual pre-presentation confidence. The polished wooden surface before him held not only the tablet that would control his digital presentation, but also a handwritten note card, something he hadn't relied on in business meetings for over a decade, containing words he had struggled over late into the night. An acknowledgement he had finally recognized was necessary, regardless of its professional consequences. Eleanor Winters, seated at the far end of the table, caught his eye with a questioning lift of her eyebrow, clearly noting the uncharacteristic hesitation in his demeanor, the absence of the commanding presence that typically defined these sessions. "Before we begin the formal presentation," Henry said once the room had quieted, his voice steady despite the unfamiliar nervousness churning in his stomach, "I need to make something clear about the Riverview Center redesign." A ripple of attention moved through the assembled group, board members exchanging glances that ranged from curious to concerned. The architectural solutions that salvaged this project were not developed in-house, nor by our contracted firms. Henry tapped his tablet, bringing to the main screen a professional headshot of Abigail from her days at the architectural firm she had left to care for Zoe, her expression in the photo serious yet undeniably vibrant, the same quality that had drawn him to her from their first real conversation. "This is Abigail Reed, a former principal designer at Meridian Associates who has been consulting on the Riverview project for the past 2 months. Every innovation you approved in our last meeting came directly from her vision and expertise." The explanation that followed, carefully edited to exclude their initial meeting at Foster's Market, was met with expressions ranging from surprise to approval, the board members appreciating the strategic decision to bring in specialized talent, even as they wondered why their CEO seemed so unusually invested in acknowledging this particular consultant's contribution. Only Eleanor Winters, with her decades of experience reading corporate dynamics, narrowed her eyes slightly at the intensity in Henry's voice when he described Abigail's unique approach to community-centered design, recognizing in his tone something that went beyond professional admiration. When he concluded this introduction by stating his intention to offer Abigail a permanent position, heading a new community development division within Lawson Innovations, the murmurs around the table were largely supportive, though tinged with curiosity about this sudden expansion into an area tangential to the company's core technology focus. "An impressive resume," Eleanor commented, studying the professional history Henry had displayed alongside Abigail's photograph. "But perhaps we should focus on the actual designs before discussing organizational restructuring." Her tone was mild, but her message clear. Henry was getting ahead of himself, allowing personal considerations to influence business decisions in a way that merited caution. With a nod of acknowledgement, Henry launched into the presentation proper, guiding the board through Abigail's comprehensive redesign with a thoroughness that left no question unanswered, no budget concern unaddressed. Yet throughout the technical explanations and financial projections, He was acutely aware of Abigail's absence, of how her passion for the project's human impact would have transformed this dry corporate ritual into something alive with possibility. The irony wasn't lost on him, that only after her departure had he fully recognized how her perspective had begun to change his own, making him see beyond profit margins and shareholder value to the actual lives that would be shaped by their decisions. Just as Henry reached the conclusion of his presentation, the boardroom door opened quietly, and Ms. Chen slipped in with an apologetic expression that transformed to urgency as she caught his eye. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, addressing the room but looking directly at Henry. "But there's someone here who insists on speaking to the board about the Riverview project. She says she's—" Before his assistant could finish, the door opened wider to reveal Abigail herself, dressed not in the casual clothes she had worn at the construction site, but in a tailored navy suit that spoke of her former professional life, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek chignon rather than her usual practical ponytail. The sight of her, composed, determined, undeniably elegant in this setting so different from where he had come to know her, struck Henry with a force that momentarily robbed him of speech, the tablet in his hand forgotten, as the board members turned in their chairs to regard this unexpected visitor. "Ms. Reed," Henry finally managed, hyper-aware of the curious gazes now moving between them, searching for clues to explain the obvious tension crackling in the air. "We were just discussing your contributions to the project." Abigail's eyes met his briefly before scanning the room, taking in the assembled power brokers with a calm assessment that revealed neither intimidation nor deference. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But I understand this is the final approval meeting for the Riverview Center, and there are aspects of the design implementation that haven't been addressed." Without waiting for permission, a boldness that elicited raised eyebrows around the table and an unexpected surge of admiration from Henry, she moved to the presentation system and connected her own tablet, bringing up a series of renderings that hadn't been part of Henry's carefully prepared materials. "These modifications," she continued, moving through the images with confident efficiency, "address the sustainability concerns raised in last quarter's environmental impact review, while actually reducing the overall construction timeline by approximately 3 weeks. What followed was a masterclass in architectural problem-solving, as Abigail walked the board through design adjustments that preserved all the innovative elements they had already approved, while enhancing the project's environmental profile and operational efficiency. Henry watched, transfixed as she fielded technical questions with unassuming expertise, her passion for the project evident in every precisely articulated explanation. This was Abigail in her professional element, the architect whose career had been sidelined by personal circumstances, but whose talent remained undiminished. And seeing her this way, commanding the attention of some of the most powerful figures in the business world, with nothing but the strength of her ideas, Henry felt a surge of something beyond admiration or attraction, a recognition of her as a complete person with depths and capabilities he was only beginning to understand, despite the weeks they had spent collaborating. The board's reaction was unmistakably positive, with even the typically reserved Eleanor Winters leaning forward with evident interest as Abigail concluded her presentation. "These are impressive refinements, Ms. Reed," Eleanor said, voicing what had become the clear consensus around the table. "May I ask why they weren't included in the materials we received from Mr. Lawson?" The question hung in the air, laden with potential complication, and Henry found himself holding his breath as he waited for Abigail's response. She paused, her eyes meeting his across the expanse of polished wood, and in that moment of suspended communication, he saw not anger or resentment, but something more complex, a challenge perhaps, or an opportunity for truth. "These adjustments were developed after my formal consultation period ended," she said finally, her gaze still locked with Henry's. "I continued working on the project independently because I believe in what it can mean for the community it will serve, regardless of other considerations." In the discussion that followed, as board members asked follow-up questions and debated fine points of implementation, Henry remained uncharacteristically silent, watching Abigail navigate this world so different from Foster's Market, with the same authentic presence she brought to every environment. When the vote was finally called, and the Riverview Center received unanimous approval to proceed with her enhanced design, the professional triumph was evident in the subtle lift of her shoulders, the barely contained smile that curved her lips, expressions he had come to recognize during their weeks of collaboration, but which now seemed precious in their genuine reflection of her character. As the meeting adjourned and board members filed out with congratulatory murmurs, Henry remained where he stood, waiting until only he and Abigail remained in the vast boardroom, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "You came back," he said finally, the simplicity of the statement belying its significance to him. Abigail gathered her materials with deliberate movements before meeting his gaze, her expression serious but no longer distant. "Not for you," she replied, the honesty between them restored if not yet the trust. "For the project, for the people it will help." Then, with a straightening of her shoulders that suggested the next words didn't come easily, "And maybe to finish what we started, if you're ready to begin again, without the lies this time." The reconstruction of the Riverview Community Center advanced with remarkable speed, translating Abigail Reed's vision into steel and concrete. Henry Lawson, who had initially involved himself in the project for corporate reasons, began visiting the construction site under increasingly flimsy pretenses, drawn not only by the building's progress, but by Abigail's presence. The easy rapport they once shared had been replaced by a relationship that was professionally cordial, but emotionally restrained. Weekly meetings became their only arena for interaction, every word weighed carefully to avoid reopening old wounds. Yet Henry could not ignore the quiet magnetism of the architect, who, even after disappointment, carried the same integrity that had first captivated him. One crisp autumn afternoon, Henry found Abigail alone in the main hall, watching the golden light filter through newly installed windows. The scene's quiet poetry stirred something in him that words couldn't name. They spoke about the project, the improved flooring, the contractor's suggestions, the subtle way light interacted with space, and beneath those practical exchanges about something deeper. An unspoken recognition of her rare combination of talent and generosity. Though the conversation remained formal, its subtext was unmistakable. Henry longed for a chance at redemption, not as a CEO, but as a man seeking forgiveness. There, surrounded by glass and dust, he finally dropped the professional facade and confessed the real reason for his visit. True to her nature, Abigail confronted him with composure, asking what he truly sought. Henry, stripped of pretense, spoke of the disconnection between his accomplishments and the humanity behind them. He recalled the moment in the grocery store when she had helped him, a stranger in an awkward situation, and how that gesture had dismantled the barriers he'd built over years of corporate success. His words carried a vulnerability rare for a man in his position. What he offered was not just a request for coffee, it was a plea to begin again, to rebuild something genuine upon the ruins of his earlier deception. Abigail's answer came not in promises, but in boundaries. Just coffee as a starting point. It was enough. Over time, coffee turned into lunches, and lunches into quiet moments of shared honesty. Abigail spoke of her life as a single mother, of the sacrifices she had made for her daughter Zoe. Henry, in turn, revealed the cost of his own achievements, the loneliness hidden beneath the layers of prestige. Each conversation became a brick in a new kind of structure, mutual understanding, respect, and cautious hope. Slowly, the architect and the executive began designing something neither had intended to build, a bridge between two very different worlds. When Abigail invited Henry to dinner at her apartment, it marked a quiet milestone. There, among children's drawings and stacks of architectural sketches, he witnessed the world she had built from love and perseverance. Zoe's playful creativity mirrored her mother's, and Henry found himself deeply moved by the life they had constructed together. Simple, imperfect, but full of meaning. That night, he understood belonging not as ownership or achievement, but as presence. What Abigail had designed, both in her home and her life, was a living blueprint of care, a structure supported by sacrifice and sincerity. Winter arrived, and the construction site transformed into a landscape of frost and steel. Henry continued visiting, more for Abigail than the project itself. Their relationship had evolved, still undefined, yet undeniably significant. On a day when snow threatened to halt work, Henry found her in the future library, reviewing design details. Their exchange, light and easy, ended with his spontaneous invitation to join him and Zoe the next day for snowman building. The following morning, laughter and snowflakes replaced the formality that once separated them. Watching Abigail and her daughter, Henry began to understand the true measure of success, not in profits or power, but in the quiet endurance of love and connection. Their closeness culminated in an unexpected proposal. Henry announced the creation of a new community development division within Lawson Innovations, a permanent commitment inspired by Abigail's work and philosophy. He offered her the directorship, full autonomy included. The offer, though professional on the surface, carried personal weight. Abigail questioned the nature of his role in this arrangement. Would he be her superior or her equal? The question tested everything they had rebuilt between them. Henry's answer came without hesitation. Your partner. Simple, unpolished, but deeply sincere. Abigail, ever cautious, didn't accept immediately. She reminded him that true structures require solid foundations. Could trust, once broken, truly support what they were building now? Henry admitted he wasn't certain, only that she had changed his understanding of value and purpose. His words, unguarded and heartfelt, revealed a man willing to dismantle everything false in himself to build something real with her. Partnership, he said, was what he wanted, in every sense of the word. Her silence stretched long before she finally spoke. Partnership requires trust, she said, setting her terms clearly. Zoe would always come first. Any future they built had to honor that truth. Henry agreed without hesitation, and when their gloved hands met on the park bench, with Zoe's laughter echoing across the snow, they both understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The story that had started with a declined credit card now arrived at its true design. A life constructed patiently and honestly, one brick, one heartbeat at a time.